Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show. We are more than honored to have Marc Victor back for the second time. He is a very well-known attorney, an attorney for freedom, and he's licensed in both Arizona and Hawaii. And there is this little known law, though, I believe, and I forget what it's called, where I think it's pro something Vichy, where attorneys are able to represent uh, individuals throughout the country, for instance. And I think that's a service that you do offer. So I just know people aren't aware of that. And generally speaking, courts do grant that. You have a right to your choice of counsel. So thank you so much for joining us today, Marc.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And Pro Hoc Vice is basically a way for lawyers who are not licensed in a particular state to be admitted really for one case in that state. So that's why we have a national practice. I represent people in state courts and in federal courts throughout the United States. And yeah, sometimes we use the Pro Hoc Vice rules. No big deal. If we have a lot of cases like we do, I'm in Hawaii here today, hence the Aloha shirt. Then we got to take the bar exam and get admitted, and then you don't have to do Pro Hoc Vice anymore. So not a big deal, just lawyer stuff.
Excellent. Well, you recently had a successful run on the Libertarian Party ticket in Arizona. You did leave the race, I believe, because of course there's always controversy with libertarians when they're running. That many argue that the Libertarian splits the vote away from the Republican, which then gives the Democrat an inroad to perhaps winning a seat or whatever. And you actually, so I believe, dropped out of the race. I don't know the full details of that. Assuming that those votes, which I believe you're pulling upwards of 20%, would go to the Republican candidate. Can you speak about your campaign, why you ran, the success
Yeah,
of it?
yeah, it's a great question. It's true. I did run as the Libertarian Party candidate for United States Senate in Arizona. And the reason I ran is actually much bigger than just who's going to represent Arizona in the United States Senate, which is a big deal, frankly. I'm trying to change the world. I got a big project here that I'm working on, and that's why I founded the Live and Let Live Global Peace Movement. I think we have some very serious problems that can only be solved on a global scale. And so we're trying our best to unite the reasonable people of the world around a couple of ideas that we think the Live and Let Live explains, that phrase explains pretty well. We call it the Live and Let Live philosophy. And there's really just two rules. The first is what we call our legal principle. I can explain it with the simple phrase: just don't be an aggressor. Don't put hands on other people. Don't hit people. Don't steal their stuff, and don't put them in danger. In the laws ought to all be contoured around that concept, right? So what we want to do is recalibrate all laws so that they always outlaw aggression, whether it is engaged in by an individual, any person, no exceptions to the rule, any group, any corporation, or any government. We say no exceptions. Nobody should get to aggress. We're against aggression in all cases, on all issues, at all times. And then that's our legal principle. The second rule we call our moral principle, and we describe it with the simple phrase: just be a good human. This is different than a legal rule. This is a moral rule. And so it's a suggestion. You're completely free to ignore it. But with our moral principle, be a good human, we have some aspirational values that we promote. Things like open mindedness, intolerance towards other people, involuntary kindness, and civility, building high levels of trust with other human beings, a commitment to truth and facts, whatever they are, wherever they go, even if they're different than what I actually believe right now, or you believe, or whatever. And we care about that stuff because our goal in this space here is to try to optimize human happiness and well being while we minimize suffering. That's the moral principle. People are free to ignore that. But if people agree with both the legal principle and the moral principle, they should just go to the Live and Let Live .org website. That's the home of the Live and Let Live Global Peace Movement. Check the box that says I agree with those two rules, or two principles, if you like, and become a member of the Live and Let Live Global Peace community. We're trying to change the world. We're not just wishing or hoping for peace. we're trying to get things done. We feel like we got an urgent mission. We got smaller and smaller groups of people around the world that can do greater amounts of harm. And we've got to get organized around a fundamental idea. This is the minimum standard that we have a right to expect of all other human beings. You don't get to aggress against anybody else. Everything beyond that's a suggestion, but we're making some suggestions. We think, getting these be a good human aspirational value stuff, to get people to voluntarily adopt them is how we're going to get to peace and, frankly, civility. If people look at the campaign I ran, I did nothing negative. I was positive at all times. I respect everybody's position. And but we're putting our position out there as persuasively as we can. And I don't have any interest in following party lines or even necessarily getting elected. My yardstick from the beginning has always been I will do whatever promotes the interests of freedom and peace and civility. And in my case, what I did was I made an offer, because lots of people asked me to step down under exactly what you said, Justin, that hey, you're stealing votes from this side or that side. And frankly, I had people on both sides, the Democrat side and the Republican side, that wanted me to step down. They were thinking I was stealing votes from their candidate. And I said, look, the way to get me to step down, the only way to get me to step down, is to convince me that it's in the interest of freedom and peace and civility for me to do that. So I proposed having a public discussion with either Mark Kelly or Blake Masters. Kelly was the incumbent at the time. He wound up getting reelected, and Blake Masters was the Republican. And Mark Kelly never took me up on that offer. Blake Masters did, and we sat down. We had a conversation. People can see that conversation. It was fairly short. It's at my political website, which is liveandletliverevolution.com. They can see that interview I did with Blake Masters. And while he wasn't perfect on every issue, we didn't agree on everything, we agreed on quite a few things. And so I was very pleasantly surprised that he was pro-freedom on many of those issues. And so I decided at that point that obviously I'd keep to my word. He convinced me that he was trying to move things in that direction. So I stepped down and endorsed him. Unfortunately, he didn't win. Mark Kelly won. I released a video yesterday congratulating Mark Kelly and wishing him well and wishing him success, at least in the areas that we agree on. And I don't know a lot about Mark Kelly's positions, but I think we are in some agreement on certain issues, civil liberty type issues for sure. And so I wish him great success on those issues. And then I'll chart a course for whatever comes up next. And there's a chance I could run as a libertarian again. There's a chance I could change and run as a Republican maybe in a couple of years. Obviously, I would want somebody to approach me and say, hey, Mark, I'm interested in helping fund such a campaign. If that happens, that would motivate me maybe to do something in that direction. Or I may say, enough with politics. I'm not going to run for anything. I'm just going to be busy promoting the Live and Let Live global peace movement. I don't think change comes from politics. I think change comes from people when they change their hearts and minds. And I don't think we need everybody. We need more than we have now, maybe 20% to 33%, somewhere in there. And I think we'll get there. I think we have a good message, and I'm happy to put it out there and tell everybody what it is we're talking about. Some people say it's too simple, but there's a lot of issues on my website that all we do is reason very consistently with those two principles.
I was speaking with somebody yesterday about your campaign, and they had mentioned that you had pulled at upwards of 20%. That might be wrong. What was the best that you pulled at one point?
The highest number I heard on a poll was 15%, which is still unheard of for a libertarian. At the end of the day, I stepped down and asked people to vote for Blake Masters. So, but I don't pay attention to who's voting for me. I'm trying to get people to get their hearts and minds around this live and let live philosophy, because I want to change the world. I think the problem is bigger than any one state or any one country. I think we need to unite people around the world. We got problems like artificial intelligence and synthetic biology and nukes. No one country can solve these problems. There are threats that can emanate from anywhere in the world. That's why we've got to coalesce. It's time that we coalesce around a philosophy that we call live and let live. We got to get this done. It's not an option anymore.
And I think that how people are voting shows that we're in a much different time. We have independent or third party candidates in a bunch of different races in 2022 that I think earned or received more votes than they would have in many years past. And there's been a few points in U.S. history where third party candidates start really getting 15%, etc. And now is one of those times it appears. Now you mentioned that the Democrats asked you to step down because they thought you were taking votes from their candidate. And I saw in like mainstream press recently that actually Democrats were supporting the third party candidates or more radical Republican candidates in Republican primaries so as to help their candidate win. The thinking being that if their candidate went against a more radical Republican in a race, they were more likely to win. Did you experience anything like that in Arizona?
Yeah, I did. There were several Democrat groups who funded my campaign. I'm sure thinking that it would help the Democrats, but I don't play politics, and so the Democrats funded my campaign. But as I've said on many occasions, I don't care who's funding my campaign, nor do I care what group I'm speaking to. I say exactly the same things. I've been saying the same things for 30 years, so I'm not likely to change my position unless, of course, I'm persuaded to change my position. That's the only way you get me to change my positions. You got to convince me that my position is wrong and that there's a better position out there. So maybe they had some egg on their face because ultimately I got on the ballot and wound up moving to withdraw and endorsing the Republican. So it's funny that funded by the Dems, ran as a libertarian and endorsed a Republican. It goes to show you that I'm not about parties. I'm about freedom and peace and civility. And however we get there, as long as we don't have to sacrifice our integrity or our principles or anything like that, I'm in favor of whatever gets us in that direction. That's what I have done, and that's what I intend to continue to do.
And Democrats might have been happy that you endorsed the Republican. It sounds like if they
I don't
thought
know
that.
about that. It was a very close race. I think that my opinion about what happened nationally is that excuse me, the Republicans hitched their wagon to Donald Trump and all of his divisiveness and name calling and the tribalism and the kind of stuff that we do not need any more of. We didn't need it in the first place. And I think that showed to be a losing strategy. And so I'm very optimistic and hopeful that it'll dawn a new day here in the United States where we go back to a civilized world where we're not calling people names. Let's sit down and talk about our underlying philosophy. Where is it we disagree? And let's talk philosophy. Let's put our ideas up against each other and let people decide which ideas are better. It's not about name calling and all this other stuff. So I was disappointed to see Donald Trump is going to run for president again. But on the other hand, this may turn out to be better because I expect that he will be rejected, not because of his policies, because of course there were things, in my opinion, about Donald Trump's policies, while none of them perfect, some of them moved us in the right direction. So I want to be careful about my criticisms here, but my criticisms emanate from my perception of the man's lack of character. The fact that he called people names and was divisive. I think we don't need that any longer in American politics. I think we need people who are more statesmanly like, people who speak more respectfully of other people. And that's the course I intend to chart and continue to follow.
And for as crude as Donald Trump is, the people who try to be like him on a debate stage or wherever are cruder because they're not him and it just there was a lot of candidates in the Republican Party who were trying to be Trump on stage rather than be themselves, it seems. And that's a travesty, especially at a time when I feel like the Republican Party could take an advantage of people looking for civil liberty protections.
Yeah,
And
I think that the Democrats probably didn't do themselves any favors in the first year and a half of the Biden administration. You could say the wheels fell off and the roof is on fire. But yet, people, I think, are so fed up with the divisiveness and the politics that we've had coming from the Republicans that I think the message here for Republicans is enough of this road of divisiveness and chart a new course, more of a Ronald Reagan, dignified, civilized kind of approach. If we disagree, that's fine. Let's disagree on policy. Let's disagree on philosophy. Let's disagree in ways that are agreeable. If you notice in the debate that I had with Mark Kelly and Blake Masters, and people are free to watch it, it's at my political website, liveandletliverevolution.com. I didn't call anybody names. I was respectful of other people. I called them out when I disagreed with them, and I complimented them when I agreed with them. I think it's perfectly fine and effective to have a debate that is above board and respectful and gentlemanly, like in kind. I just think it's a terrible idea. We've had enough of this at each other's throats stuff.
Blake Masters was, I think, called or perhaps referred to himself as, maybe it was just a pundit who said this, as a Ron Paul Republican. And I think that there is this, the Ron Paul revolution is still very much alive. I think the Live and Let Live revolution in many ways is a continuation perhaps of the Ron Paul revolution. Can you speak to the Ron Paul Republican ethos and how is it alive and well still?
Well, it goes back before Ron Paul. It was Ronald Reagan who noted that the heart and soul of the Republican Party is libertarian. Ron Paul was a libertarian before he was a Republican, and I feel like Ron Paul feels, which is let's just advance the cause of liberty, whether it's with an L, an R, a D, or anything else. It doesn't matter to me. I could be a member of any party. I'm going to say exactly the same things. And to the extent that any party platform is in disagreement with me, I would say the party platform is wrong. So I'm not going to cling to any particular party platform. I think the Ron Paul revolution was probably a high watermark for libertarianism. I think Ron did more to advance libertarian ideas. I think the Live and Let Live revolution and the Live and Let Live global peace movement will be a new high water mark. In fact, I think we're going to get it done. I think we have the best version, the most simple version, the most effective version, the most uncompromised version of the freedom and peace message. I mean, Live and Let Live is really, it's not accurate to say that Live and Let Live is the same as libertarianism. Libertarianism, yes, many libertarians agree with what I called rule number one: don't be an aggressor. That's generally the libertarian position. But libertarianism doesn't say anything about morality. And we need to say something about morality if we're going to get to peace. That's why Live and Let Live is a peace movement, not merely a freedom movement. And so there are reasons we need to do this. First, if you speak of morality, you have a reason to distinguish the difference between a legal rule and a moral rule. And people really need to understand this. To say, I'm against prostitution doesn't really tell me anything. Are you against it legally or are you against it morally? That makes all the difference. And if people can't distinguish between those two, they're not thinking about the question correctly. So having a separate legal principle and a moral principle helps really highlight the critically important difference between a moral rule and a legal rule. And then the second reason is we need to say something about morality. We're not saying too much here. I mean, to say be a good human doesn't go far enough that most good people are arguing about morality. If we kept going, right, we'd be arguing about morality. We know people don't all agree on morality, but basic morality, simple morality, the ideas about being a good human, these are things that good people generally are not in disagreement about. And they're the kinds of things we really need to get to peace, right? I mean, the libertarian sort of ethos or construct gets us to freedom, but we could still hate each other's guts. We could yell our, insults at each other. As long as we're not trespassing on each other's property, we're good libertarians, but we're certainly not living in peace. And so Live and Let Live is an effort to get beyond where libertarianism is trying to go. And I think it also presents a more complete theory than libertarianism does. Libertarianism sometimes leaves people with this sort of morally unsatisfying, you get the person who's not an aggressor, but is still kind of a jerk, and they're left alone. And the libertarians will say, well, you don't have to do business with them or something like that. And that's true, but it doesn't leave people very satisfied. Live and Let Live goes a little further and says, look, we can try to inspire this person to act better. And while they're free to act that way, as long as they don't aggress, they're not part of our movement. Our movement is filled with people who are trying to inspire people to act better. And I think this presents a much better message. It's more palatable for people. And I think it's proving to be a more effective message without compromising any of the important principles. I mean, we're against aggression in all cases at all times with no exceptions. And that's the way to get to freedom and peace and, frankly, civility. And so I think the message is going to succeed because of the strength of the message, not because of a fancy jingle or something like that.
And it's really in many ways an idea whose time has come seemingly and increasingly now. And part of that might be the internet with the velocity of information that's being able to be spread. I think I don't have much of a memory pre-internet. However, it does seem that the effect of the internet on the velocity of information has allowed me to come across many ideas that I might otherwise not have come across, and come across them at a young age too. I'm looking at election results uh, out of Pennsylvania and also out of Massachusetts. Election results in Pennsylvania let libertarians claim party status. It's being called a historic and happy day for Pennsylvania's Libertarian Party. Same in, it looks like, Massachusetts. The state's libertarians are expected to regain their major party status after placing second in a statewide race in Tuesday's midterm elections. So, do you have any sense of how libertarians fared generally across the U.S. in the 2022 midterms?
Well, libertarians have always been a mixed bag because they like to argue about things and can't seem to get together on the same page on lots of issues. I had libertarians who were very upset with me because I was running as a libertarian. And they said, look, Blake Masters is pretty pro libertarian. And so, Mark, you shouldn't be running as. I had libertarians telling me not to run as a libertarian. And there was a sizable number of them who took this position. And then there were other libertarians who said, Mark, we're glad you're running as a libertarian. We don't want you to step down. We're very upset that you endorsed the Republican. And look, there are different strategies. We don't all have to follow the same strategy. But one of the things I'll say about libertarians generally as a group, and of course, anytime you generalize, you're going to make some errors here. But I wish libertarians were less critical of other libertarians. I think that it makes sense before you call somebody out for doing something, maybe send an email or have a conversation. Hey, what is it you're thinking about when you're doing this or that? Are they representing the libertarian philosophy properly or with dignity and these kinds of things? If they are, great. There isn't a central plan to achieve freedom. There are different ways that and different approaches that appeal to different people. I think, I certainly wish libertarians well, but the libertarian message has been out there for a long time and it carries a lot of baggage. I don't think the position has been explained very well by libertarians. They don't start with the principle. You notice when we talked about live and let live, I immediately talked about the legal principle and the moral principle. I didn't start by saying we should legalize methamphetamine or prostitution should be legal or taxes or theft or something. When you start with consequences of the principle, people don't understand the underlying principle and they therefore reject the position. They're not listening. And the libertarians go nowhere for this reason. I had the honor of introducing Jo Jorgensen when she was running for president in Arizona. And I listened to her speech for an hour and a half, and she never even mentioned the non-aggression principle one time. She went issue by issue, and that was great. But there were a lot of people there who were trying to figure out what's a libertarian. And what they got was, oh, libertarians believe in this issue and this issue and this issue and this issue. But they never understood the one thing that makes a libertarian, which is an agreement on a principle that the libertarians call the non-aggression principle. We live and let livers call that the live and let live legal principle, which I think, again, is an easier thing to understand. People say non-aggression, I'm for self-defense. And now all of a sudden the libertarian has got to dig out of that hole and say, no, self-defense is a response to aggression. We're talking about an initiation. But it's because non-aggression is a little tricky for people to understand. I think live and let live is a phrase that people intuitively not only understand, but agree with. And so when you say the live and let live legal principle, they say, these are the rules that the law, these are the rules you can't break, like don't be an aggressor. And then the live and let live moral principle. All right, it's morality. we're trying to encourage you, but there are no more, there shouldn't be any moral crimes, so you're free to ignore them. And I think it breaks it down right from the beginning and makes it easier for people to understand. I think it's an improvement on the message, and that's why I think Live and Let Live is the future of the freedom movement and the future of the peace movement.
There was another notable, or one in particular notable libertarian in a race in Georgia, Chase Oliver. Here's kind of a clickbaity headline about him: an anti-police former Democrat attracting votes as a libertarian in the Georgia Senate race. I believe he got a little over 2% of the vote there. So I think the Libertarian Party is making some interesting noise, and
Well,
I'm tempted.
anti-police doesn't excite me. I don't know
Me
what that
neither.
means,
Yeah.
anti-police. I'm not, look, I've been a criminal defense lawyer for 28 years, and I've dealt with probably far more police officers than Chase Oliver has dealt with. And what I say is I'm very pro good police officer and very anti bad police officer. The real problem, well, there are good cops and bad cops for sure. In my opinion, there are far more good cops than bad. And what I mean by good simply is that they follow the law, they're not corrupt. But the problem here is that the law is wrong, right? You could be a good cop following the law, but if the law says arrest somebody for smoking marijuana peacefully in their backyard, someone who's a competent adult, okay, the law's wrong. And so is this a good cop or a bad cop? Okay, there's some discussion that could be had here, but it's overbroad to say somebody is anti-police or pro-police. Let's get the law straightened out first, and then let's worry about enforcing the right laws rather than just going after enforcement right now when some of the laws are very wrong and should be taken off the books. Which, when I say some, I mean all of the laws that are victimless crimes, all of the laws that have nothing to do with whether somebody is aggressing or, said another way, violating the Live and Let Live legal principle. If you're not violating that legal principle, you should be left alone, because to not leave somebody alone in those circumstances is to yourself violate the Live and Let Live legal principle.
Lax enforcement has been in the press a lot lately. So one example might be decriminalizing certain drugs. I believe in Portland, for instance, we saw an example of that, and in a few other cities. What is your position on that, which is generally considered a right now, at least today, a left-leaning position, to use the parlance of our times?
Well, I rather lax enforcement of laws that shouldn't be on the books than efficient enforcement of laws that shouldn't be on the books. So I prefer that. But that's not going to get us to where we need to get to. The right answer here is to enforce the proper laws, right? To get rid of the wrong laws, which are any law that has no connection to the Live and Let Live legal principle. Let's get that off the books to begin with, and then let's very fairly and efficiently and reasonably, with due process, enforce all of the remaining laws, which should remain on the books. Like, look, just to take the criminal side, and things like murder, rape, robbery, burglary, assault, trespass. We don't want lax enforcement of these things. We want accurate, efficient enforcement of these things. Prostitution between competent and consenting adults. We don't need any enforcement here. Let's get this law off the books. But if it's on the books, let's not enforce it. It shouldn't be enforced. It's immoral to enforce such a law, because what you're doing is you are aggressing against people. That should be illegal.
Looking at Arizona, I'm curious, what do you believe Arizonans can expect from Blake Masters?
Well, Blake didn't get elected, so you mean in terms of his future political plans?
Yes, yes.
Well, I don't know. I had a nice, my conversation with Blake was very short. People have criticized me, libertarians especially, for withdrawing and then supporting Blake. And I often will write back and say, "Did you watch the interview I had with Blake Masters?" And often the answer is no. And I say, "Well, look, why don't you get the facts first? Watch the interview." So we had a nice interview. He made it clear in the interview, accurately so, that we hadn't spoken one word since the debate. It was our first public discussion, first discussion of any type, and that's fine. But since that discussion, I have had some private discussions with Blake Masters. I've met his dad now. I've talked to some of his friends from high school. I think this guy is a real freedom guy. I wish he hadn't hitched his wagon to the Donald Trump crowd. I think ultimately that is the reason he did not get elected. I think the same is probably true for Kari Lake, who ran as a Republican for governor of Arizona. I think the reason they both didn't get elected is because they went down and followed in the Donald Trump's footsteps of name calling and belittling and being disrespectful towards other people, and also denying election results. I think didn't help them as well either. I think that people don't want to go back and relitigate the election of 2020. They need to move forward. We got real problems that we've got to solve. And so I think had they not done that, had they run as live and let live candidates and said, look, I'm for live and let live. Let's stop aggression and everything else. Let's try to inspire people to act better. Let's stop the spending. Let's cut down on the taxation dramatically. We got to get inflation out of control. Let's stop printing money. These kinds of things. Let's get rid of all these unnecessary regulations. And when I say unnecessary, I mean anything unconnected to the live and let live legal principle is unnecessary. So all of those we should get rid of. If had they been singing that tune, I think they had a much better chance at getting elected rather than calling people names.
Amazing. The way that was normalized through the Donald Trump presidency. And I, of course, did not like the way in which he was campaigning back in 2016, I believe it was. But he
Yeah.
got elected. He got elected. And then his policies, firstly, on the night, I was actually at I was working as a journalist on the election night 2016, and I was at a cannabis legalization party in California just because I got invited as a journalist. So I was kind of walking around that, watching that, and everybody was so disappointed when Hillary Clinton lost. And I thought that night, well, we'll see if he opens up any new theaters of war. And 4 years later, he hadn't. And that's just one example of policies which made more sense than the policies I had seen heretofore, particularly throughout the 21st century. And that got normalized, and we saw it all permeate the Republican Party, and a lot of people trying to be Trump rather than be themselves. Even Ron DeSantis, although there's some tension there between Trump and DeSantis, even he was kind of taking that tact in his debate where he did not perform very well. I didn't think he didn't come across looking well. I'm looking at some news that's just breaking. Apparently, the GOP has won the House. Do you have a reaction to that? Republicans win control of the House as of an hour ago.
Well, I'm not certainly not surprised here. I think this was a strong expectation. I guess my take here is we're going to get gridlock, right? At least to some extent. And in my opinion, gridlock is better and more preferable than the vast majority of the things that the Biden administration is trying to accomplish. I mean, we don't need more taxing. We don't need more spending. We don't need more government in almost every area. And so we certainly don't need more political correctness and wokeness and all of these other things that it's coming out of the radical left right now. So I'm not a big fan of the radical left, nor am I a fan of the radical right. I think there's a substantial group in the middle, the people left over, frankly, that are on the left, but not the radical left, and the right, but not the radical right. That's the group of people I'm trying to talk to, that I think we can unite around this idea of live and let live. Look, people are going to live differently than maybe we want them to live. That's the price you got to pay if you want a free society. The cost of admission to that free society is you have to put up with the fact that people live differently than maybe you live or you want them to live. What you can demand of them is however they're living, they shouldn't aggress against anybody, right? If they're willing to do that, and they have to do that because that's what the law should say, then that's good enough, right? Don't aggress. That's the minimum standard of conduct we have every right to demand. So I think we're going to get gridlock going forward. We'll see what happens in 2 years. I hope it's not a replay of Trump v. Biden. I think that would be a disaster for the United States and for the world. I certainly hope we're not going to get Donald Trump. I'd be happy if we didn't get Joe Biden. But frankly, I don't see anybody on the left who's going to be better than Joe Biden. So I'm hoping a pro live and let live candidate will emerge, somebody reasonable, somebody who we can, again, look up to, maybe somebody who can present, somebody who we can take our little kids and say, look, that's the president of the United States. Look up to this person. Let's have respect for this person because they command it, because of the way they act and speak. These kinds of things. I think virtually everything about how Donald Trump acted was the wrong thing. And I'd like to see 180 degrees from that. I'd like to see a very strong move. And people say, look, we don't care what your position is. We're not going to be taken in by incivility anymore.
And any comments on the Arizona gubernatorial race?
Well, I didn't interview either one of the two candidates. I didn't know. I don't know what Katie Hobbs is about. I hear good things about Carrie Lake, but again, I didn't sit down and talk to her. So until I sit down and have a real discussion with somebody, I don't know really what's in their hearts. I can't tell from a 30-second commercial bashing on their political opponent what they're actually for. I'm interested in what is in a person's heart, what is in their mind. Really, how do they feel about our rule about aggression? Do you ever think it's okay to aggress to accomplish any particular goals? That'd be one of my first questions. If the answer is yes, okay, we're not going to agree. I think aggression is always, always wrong. It was wrong in kindergarten. Keep your hands to yourself. Don't take the other kids' toys. It remained wrong all through grammar school and junior high and high school and college, and it's still wrong today. There's no reason to change that rule. Some people think that what I'm saying is too simple. They say, oh, Mark, it sounds great. Everybody loves freedom, peace, and civility. Okay, well, I challenge you, go to my political website. I put more information about my political positions in great detail, every word of which I wrote myself, and where I detail lots of issues. And all I do is I simply reason very consistently with those two rules, and you'll see exactly that we come out on the right side of every single issue, including the abortion issue. Yeah, that's a tough one, but go look at what we say about abortion. I think you'll find this is the best way for us to get past it, where we're not fighting about it forever. In fact, I never give my personal position on any issues. My Marc J. Victor's personal position on any issue is irrelevant, does not matter. The question is, what is it? What's the right position if we care about a free society, a peaceful society? That's the question. What should the rule be for those ends, not for Marc Victor's goals?
And a civilized society too, because I see, I've started going to city councils regularly, and it's opened my eyes up. Maybe in smaller towns, it's a little bit sillier. You can poke fun at it, but in the larger cities, there's real problems that are and real pain and suffering that's taking place. And as Houston, Texas discovered, the solution to the homelessness problem was to simply give the unhoused an apartment with a lock on it and a bathroom in there. And that was the only way to get people off the streets and somewhere where they could then begin treating them for whatever ailed them, oftentimes drugs, or simply trying to get a job somehow. And in Houston, I think people from both sides of the aisle came together and they saw what isn't the what they didn't ask themselves, what does our political view tell us about how to solve this problem? They asked themselves, what is the pragmatic thing for us to do? Well, it's cheaper to give them their own apartments. They'll go to the apartments. They don't go to the shelters because there's no door. Oftentimes there's terms for you going to a shelter, like you can't do drugs, but it's just not pragmatic. It wasn't working. And Houston, I think, has shown a way forward to solving some of these very difficult problems in such a way as you're suggesting they are taken care of. Who cares what we think? What's the right thing to do? And that they say that too in Houston. It was the moral thing to do.
Yeah, I always in favor of doing the moral thing. I'm never in favor of doing the moral thing through the government or legislation. I think that morality should be outside the law. We should be very careful to take all of our moral views and put them outside. Doesn't mean we don't think they're important. I think moral positions are very important. In fact, we're promoting them with Live and Let Live. We're just promoting them outside the law. I think homelessness is a complex problem. There are different reasons why people are homeless. I think in the long term, I think there's lots of short-term fixes, but in the long term, having a healthy, growing, productive, prosperous, vibrant economy is what fixes. This is what raises standards of living, right, and creates jobs. And so We need to do, there's no mystery here. Capitalism and free markets and people trading. This is how you raise standards of living. Not to say that people have to be involved in capitalism. As long as they're not aggressing, they can do whatever they want. They can be socialists and pool their money together and live together. What I totally am in favor of that if that's what people choose to do. What they don't have a right to do is to forcefully drag other people into their arrangements if they don't want to be part of those arrangements. Nobody has a right to force anybody to do anything else. The only thing we have a right to do is demand that they don't aggress. So I think if we stick with the basic principles and we follow that, we're going to get, if what you care about is freedom and peace and civility and really prosperity, we're going to get those things. It's not a mystery. We know it. It's 2022. We have a pretty good idea of what raises standards of living at this point. Let's let people, the owners of their own money, decide what to do with it. I mean, at the end of the day, what is your fair share of the money in somebody else's wallet? I would say zero. We should honor that. It's called property. It's what it means to own something. You get to decide how to use it.
And unfortunately, in a lot of the city councils I attend, that is somewhat of a foreign concept. Okay, now news. People I've learned just are really out there looking for news on the internet, and so I'm curious. Are there any is there any news that you're following that you think is important that maybe people are underestimating, or that you just have some thoughts about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of news out there that's very important. I think and I didn't get asked this during our debate, which I thought was shocking. But obviously, what's going on between Russia and Ukraine is critically important. There was a story that broke just recently that Russian missiles have landed in Poland and killed 2 Polish people there. But it turns out that I understand now this is not the case, and I'm very happy to hear that, because if it was the case, we are literally that close to being on the brink of a war between nuclear armed superpowers. And this is untenable. I can't believe the president of the United States has not sat down in a room with Vladimir Putin. If I was the president of the United States, I would call up Vladimir Putin and say, you pick the room somewhere in the world. You and I are going to sit in there until we can come out with a brokered solution that's a win-win-win. We need to get this thing done and resolved. It can't keep going on. Similarly, the situation with China and Taiwan is also a problem. We could wake up tomorrow morning to learn that China has now invaded Taiwan. We haven't telegraphed what we're going to do, but it seems we're going to be sending arms, and we're going to be in the same proxy war kind of situation with China that we are now with Russia. I think we have paid too little attention to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I think this is a giant mistake. I think we got new problems coming. Artificial intelligence. This is a huge threat that we're not paying enough attention to. Synthetic biology. People with bad, horrible ideas can synthesize pandemics now, horrible viruses, to make them very deadly, very transmissible. We got to get a handle on this stuff. One of these things could shut down the world. I mean, we just a much smaller program like Corona. Look at what that did. We're still nowhere near recovered from these ridiculous and what I'd call unconstitutional shutdowns. So those are all very serious problems that we should be paying a lot more attention to. And yet there are other problems still that I would put in the category of existential threats. Instead of debating what is the proper pronouns for people, or who gets to play on the sports team or use the bathroom, I think we do well to put that stuff to the side. Frankly, we can solve those problems pretty easily. Who owns the bathroom in question? That's the person who makes the rules under which other people can use the bathroom. Who owns the sports league? They'll make the rules under whether people can join and what the requirements are to join. We don't have to argue about this. And look, you can ask anybody to call you any pronoun or name you like, and they can either agree or not agree, and that's the end of that issue. So we don't need to argue about this stuff anymore. This is ridiculous. We need to worry about the things that could literally terminate our species. We need to focus a lot more on that. That's why I'm pushing the Live and Let Live global peace movement so hard. It's why, look, if you're listening to this podcast, go to liveandletlive.org, check out the peace movement, check the box that says you agree if you agree. If you don't agree, I'm happy to hear from you. I'd love to know what it is you don't agree with. I mean, you're in favor of aggression, or you don't think be a good human is a good idea. But check the box, says you agree, join the movement, and then blast it out. Tell everyone on your social media, hey, there's this great new global peace movement. I just joined it. I'm urging you to join it. We need to get organized so we can get the world back on the right track before we blow ourselves up.
And that this missile that landed in Poland might have been Ukrainian, or is being said to be Ukrainian at this point, gives us a chance to take a step back and cool our heads off. It's the opposite scenario of that being a Russian missile, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
But what if it was? Where would we be right now? Would be the NATO countries would be meeting and determining what is the appropriate response, and it wouldn't be pretty. And then we'd have to sit here and wonder what's Russia's response going to be. It's untenable that we're in this situation right now. We got to get the reasonable people of the world together. We got to get more reasonable people running things. And the way to get that done is the Live and Let Live global peace movement.
And there's a lot of talk that if this escalates, that it'll be the end of our species and the end of the world, et cetera. And because of a recent city council kind of hearing that was had, that I was learned about, I was doing some research and some estimates, and who knows where these estimates are coming from. But I'm just saying that if you Google it, the first layer of estimates that you get are that in a nuclear war, approximately 100 million people or more will die, they say. So now I think that gives me an entirely different perspective of how some people might be thinking about a nuclear war, rather than thinking that it's the end of the species. That is to say that 100 million people is a lot of people, and it might, if that's the case, then I think it's important for us to recognize that it wouldn't, our species might very well continue thereafter, after a lot of death and destruction and misery. And we do have a chance to, at this point, I think, have cooler heads prevail. And there's a furious debate taking place online and in the political arena still, as we see with the third-party candidates in many places doing so well. A treasurer somewhere I saw, a libertarian treasurer, it was her versus Democrat, and she had 23%. I forget who that was or where that was, but I just saw that while I was looking at some things. Now, before we wrap up, I do news. So is there any other sort of, like, the FTX news comes to mind? This is a big news. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure what the FTX news is. I'm not
F-
familiar with that story, I suppose.
FTX it's a cryptocurrency exchange based in Bahamas, run by U.S. citizens.
Oh, yes, I'm vaguely familiar with the story. It's the only thing I know about it sounded like there was some fraud involved and people lost money. If that's the case, then okay, this is why fraud is a violation of our rule number one. I'm always against fraud in all cases.
And another interesting note, which has been getting some press, is that the founder of FTX is the number 2 donor to Democrats, behind
I
George
heard that.
Soros. But then the Supreme Court. Any thoughts generally on where the Supreme Court is at, and also maybe even in particular Clarence Thomas, who's been in the press a lot lately? Any thoughts on any of those two things?
Well, yeah, lots of things to talk about with the Supreme Court. We had a very significant Second Amendment case, the Bruin case, which I think we'll be litigating the fallout of that case for probably the next several decades. Overall, I think that was a very good case. Obviously, we had the Dobbs decision, the one that changed the landscape on the abortion question. There's a lot to talk about there. We could spend the next several hours talking about that decision. We have a decision coming up, I think, maybe next summer, that I expect will say what I would have said if I was on the Supreme Court a long time ago, which is that governments should not be discriminating on the basis of race for any reason, not even as a factor. I think the government should be blind to a person's race and sex and all this and that. And let's follow what Martin Luther King said. Let's judge people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. I don't think we can ever get by this stuff until we get past it. Let's stop talking about it. Let's move on. The United States is not institutionally racist. It certainly was at one time. The justice system is not institutionally racist. I know that people's heads will explode when they hear that comment, but We should have a conversation about it. I've been practicing in the justice system in the United States for 28 years. I've full time, major felonies, state cases, federal cases. I do cases across the nation. I do trial level. I do appeal. Not one time have I stood up and said, my client has been treated differently because of the color of his or her skin. I've never said that, not one time, not because I didn't want to. I've been on the lookout for that my entire career. I've just never felt that was the case. And why would I? We have people of all different backgrounds in, virtually as diverse as you could expect at every level and place in our justice system. So I don't, well, look, I'm not saying there's no racism in our, of course, we're never going to get to zero racism. And we should condemn all of it. None of it's right, morally speaking. But I think that this is not our major problem, nor is corruption our major problem. Do we have some? Yes. Should we aspire to zero? Yes. The problems we have in our justice system is a function of the fact that the laws are wrong. That's what's putting all these people who are peaceful in prison. That's what's creating the major problems with our system. And so I think that we're going to get a good decision out of the Supreme Court on that. So, I also will say that I think it was unfortunate that President Biden decided he was going to limit his selections to a black female. I don't think that was the right answer. I wish he had just said, "I'm going to pick the best person for the job." Now, had he picked Justice Jackson, I wouldn't have been upset at all. I listened to much of her confirmation hearings. She seemed very competent to me. I liked the fact that she was a defense attorney. I think she said a lot of good things. She certainly seems qualified. Why diminish her great achievements by saying, I'm going to limit my selections to a black female? I think that was the wrong thing to do. And I think it is disrespectful to now Justice Jackson, to have said that. So I think there's a better way to get past this stuff. I'd love to chart a new course in this area. We need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, do we really care about the color of somebody's skin? If you really care about that, or where they were born, or who they love, or what holidays they celebrate, or if they're religious or not religious, in terms of a fellow brother or sister human being, if you really care so much about those things, something's wrong with you. The problem is in the mirror, right? There's what I would say. Get your head out of where it doesn't belong, and start thinking about the character of the fellow human being. And again, they're not all good, right? If they have bad character, let's act accordingly. But if they've got good character, who cares about the package that the person of good character comes in? We shouldn't care about this stuff. Let's start respecting our fellow humans. We're on the planet for a short time. Let's rejoice and celebrate. And dare I say, love thy neighbor.
Any other comments, Mark, before we sign off?
If you're listening to this podcast and you're frustrated with what's going on in the world, I've said it several times now, be part of the solution. Go to liveandletlive.org. If you don't like what you see there, email me. I'm easy to get a hold of. It's Marc, M-A-R-C, at attorneysforfreedom.com. That's the name of my law firm, Attorneys for Freedom. And let me know. But if you do agree, and I think you will agree, join the movement and then help us get the word out. The only thing stopping us from changing the world is the extent to which we can get our message to enough people in a way that they can hear it and understand it. If that happened tomorrow, we'd be running the show. The people of Live and Let Live would be running the world, and we would get very quickly to freedom and peace and civility. And for everybody else, if they can't behave, if they're going to be aggressors, that's what we have jails for. And if they're not aggressors and they're behaving poorly, let's try to inspire them. Otherwise, if we can, great. If we can't, okay, we don't have to do business with them. We don't have to be friends with them or something, but we'll coexist with people who are at least not aggressors. This is the best we can hope for on the planet. Let's stop trying to bash other people into living in ways we think they should live. It's not the right approach.
And it's the fringes that are doing that, the far left, the far right. I was raised in this country, and very clearly the message was the content of the character is what matters in the tradition of MLK. We have had the honor and privilege of sitting down today with Marc J. Victor. You can find his work at his attorney website, attorneysforfreedom.com, also liveandletliverevolution.com. which is his political website, as well as liveandletlive.org, which is the home of a new and soon to be successful global peace movement. Thank you so much, Marc, for joining us today.
Hey, Justin, it was a real pleasure and honor to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure's all mine, and thank you everyone for listening.